Hey everyone, I'm Ann Lewis. I am the lead for Macroblitz, and in this presentation, we are going to talk about tips and tricks to identify aquatic macroinvertebrates. As a result of watching this presentation, you will be able to understand the purpose of identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates for Macroblitz, recognize the different taxonomic categories of aquatic macroinvertebrates, use taxonomy in identification, be familiar with class Insecta, and yes, we will be talking quite a bit about taxonomy, understand the importance of close observation, use a dichotomous key to identify aquatic organisms, and then at the end, we will talk about resources so you can practice your newly honed identification skills. A lot to cover. Let's get into it, starting with the purpose. Mission statement of Macroblitz is to inspire and empower people to make observations and upload them to iNaturalist for science and for learning. It doesn't say anything about identification. So why are we asking you to know how to identify your observations? Well, a lot of it has to do with that part about for science and for learning. Science and learning require IDs. This is a screenshot of an upload that's about to happen. And if we don't have an ID for this observation, that kind of eliminates its use for science and for learning. Knowing what it is will help with that. There is a great, amazing identifier community on iNaturalists. So you are not alone in this, but your preliminary identification will help the identifier community find your observation and give it a confirming ID or refine the ID along the taxonomic level. And if you're not sure what that means, we're going to circle back to this example at the very end and talk about identification. The first tip when you're thinking about identifying your organism is to change the way you think about it. So, if you're thinking, what is this organism? I suggest you reframe that question to what taxa does this organism belong to? So, our first tip is to identify the taxa. Don't worry about identifying the organism because that implies very specific level of knowledge, but just what taxa does this belong to? Let's take a moment and review what we mean by taxonomy. We're going to start our taxonomy review with kingdom, the animal level, because all the macroinvertebrates that we're going to be looking at are animals. And taxonomy is a way to group or classify organisms for identification and study. So everything we're looking at is going to be grouped in the animal kingdom because they're all animals. Below kingdom, we have phylum, classes, orders, family. It does go down tribe, genus, species, etc. For purposes of Macroblitz, we're mainly working in this space, a little bit up into phylum and classes. So we are not going to get super specific. With aquatic macroinvertebrates, insects are sort of the rock stars. When you say aquatic macroinvertebrate, most people go to insect, and insects are the class of organism. They are the class under the phylum Arthropod. So, Arthropod insecta. Now, there are a lot of aquatic macroinvertebrates that are that are not arthropods, and they're also not insects. So, we're going to take a look at those before we do a deeper dive into understanding our insects. Just as a review, aquatic macroinvertebrate. Aquatic means it spends some or all of its life in water. Macro refers to the size between micro and mega. Invertebrates, no backbone. These are some of the aquatic invertebrates that you might find, and they are not arthropods. They're in a different phylum than the insects. So, flatworms, leeches, aquatic earthworms, snails, mussels, and clams. Aquatic macroinvertebrate, but not an arthropod, not an insect. There are other organisms you'll find that are arthropods, but same phylum, but they are not insects. They're a different class. And that would include water mites and spiders, sow bugs, scuds and side swimmers. I see a lot of these when I'm out, crayfish and shrimp. Okay, let's get into the insects. So, phylum, we've talked about phylum, we've talked about class. We're going to talk a little bit about orders. Insect class have 9 orders that have an aquatic stage. So, 2 of the orders, true bugs and water beetles, you can find organisms that are aquatic when they're larvae and when they're adults. Most of the orders of insects are aquatic only during their juvenile stages, either as a larva, which means they pupate, or as a nymph, which means they don't. That includes dragonflies and damselflies. They're sort of like the rock stars of the rock stars. I think like everybody knows dragonflies and damselflies as adults. Stoneflies, mayflies, they're pretty popular too. Megaloptera, the Dobson flies, fish flies, and alder flies, caddis flies. Lots of people know about them. True flies, we know about them. We might not think of them as an aquatic insect, but they're mosquitoes. Anybody? Butterflies and moths. Some people might be surprised to learn that Lepidoptera does have does have species that have a larval stage that is aquatic. There's not a huge number of them, but they are out there. Let's take a closer look at what we mean by insect. So, insects have a head where you'll find the eyes and often an antenna. They have a chest cavity, a chest area called the thorax, not cavity, just a chest area called the thorax. Um, and that is where the wings are attached if they have wings, and the legs are attached if they have legs. Now, this one looks like the legs are attached to the head, but if you were to flip it over, you would see that it kind of crooks, it joints, so it's attached to the thorax. It has an abdomen, and PhD in entomology, Dr. Amanda Bachman, a friend of mine, she says the abdomen is where you find the squishy bits. With insects, they always have 6 legs. They never have more. So if you see a critter with more than 6 legs, it's not an insect. If you see a critter with fewer than 6 legs and it looked like it should have 6 legs, it's a damaged or injured insect. The legs are jointed and they have a little claw at the end. That is super hard to see, by the way. You need really good magnification. And so that's what all insects have. Aquatic insects often have tails, not always, and then they have gills on the abdomen or the thorax. Again, not always. These are things you're going to be looking for. Now, there is one order of insect that is not following this head, thorax, abdomen, 6 legs pattern, and that is the Diptera. They just have a head, and it might be very pronounced. It might be like kind of pulled in, but their diagnostic character is no legs. So they just have a body. They might have little nubs called prolegs. So they're kind of the oddballs. That includes things like mosquitoes and flies. Macroinvertebrates.org is, I think, the best place to go and learn about the 9 different orders of insects. I know it says of Eastern North America. There are probably other orders, or I don't really can't speak to outside that, but every place I've looked at, this has been very useful. Okay. I'm now on the website, and let's look at the 9 orders of insects and how they have them on their webpage. So we have the Coleoptera, the beetles, Diptera, the flies, Hemiptera, the Odonata, coming down to the Trichoptera, the caddisflies, up to the stoneflies, Megaloptera, very small order, but large in size, Megaloptera. Here we have the Lepidoptera, And then up here we have the Ephemeroptera or the mayflies. Let's click through to see what you will see when you click on an order. Over here, you'll have photos and information about the different families. The part you will want to pay attention to start learning the diagnostic characters of the order is over here. So we're seeing that we're in the order, and here we see the diagnostic characters of the mayfly: abdominal gills, single tarsal claw, usually three tails. So every organism on this page, all of these families have the abdominal gills, single tarsal claw, and most of them have three tails. This is where you're going to spend your time on the different orders to learn how to tell them apart. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. So this brings us to tip 2, observe closely. You are going to look at the head, the legs, the abdomen, the tails, the gills. This deep observation is really important for identifying the taxa. In fact, when I work with very young, well, not even very young, when I work with children, um, elementary, even to middle school, I have them draw their organism just to force that close observation. Hand lenses are great for close observation. All right, let's practice. We've learned to think about the taxa. We've learned close observation. Let's see if we can figure out which is the insect. I'm going to pause. If you need a few more moments, hit pause, come back when you're ready. I gave a little bit of a red herring there because the question should have been, which are the insects? But let's use our taxa mindset and our close observation mindset to sort out this question to see if we can't come up with some answers. So we're observing this organism here, the clam, and it's pretty obvious through our close observation that it doesn't have the head, the thorax, the six legs, the abdomen, and we can tell pretty easily that it's a clam. Totally different phylum, not an arthropod. Same for the snail. That immediately presents as something a not an insect. Over here, this guy has six legs. Looks like it has some tails. It's got this nice big head. Hard to see the thorax, but all the indications are there that it's an insect. And indeed it is. It's a damselfly nymph. And that leaves us this guy right here. You can kind of see these tiny little antennae, and this could be a head. No legs. So is this a fly? Is this something else? Uh, and speaks to the need for additional resources to always have with you, because you're always going to come up against something that's like, what is this? And the first resource you should be aware of is dichotomous keys. I think we have this set up so we can, yeah. Okay, so just very quickly, let me just plus in. Take a look at our dichotomous key here. This is the one developed by Macroinvertebrates team member Isai Madriz. A dichotomous key is simply you start at a point and you have two decision points. Is the shell present? Is the shell absent? And you keep working your way through the two different options till you arrive at your observation and your identification, or your, I guess, destination too. I will strongly urge you to use multiple dichotomous keys. Dichotomous keys are really hard to write for every stage of every organism. So it is possible you will find something and you will hit a brick wall as you're working your way through the dichotomous key. So you can use another dichotomous key, and I also suggest you have a print field guide for looking at the two or three most likely candidates for identification. And you look in the field guide, read what it says about the taxa, and find your answer that way. You always have the option, of course, of going up a taxonomic level. If you can't get it to order, go to insect. If you can't get it to insect, go to arthropod. that kind of thing. Which brings us back to our purpose and that whole thing about preliminary IDs and all of that. So you've just completed this training, and this is your observation, and you've uploaded it, you've checked the date and the time and the location are all present, and it's time to give the critter a species or some taxonomic level of identification. And you click on the species um, box, and iNaturalist will suggest a category for you, an identification based on computer vision. I will say that my experience is that less popular organisms, such as aquatic macroinvertebrates, the CV is all over the place. It can either be wildly over specific or just flat out wrong. So feel free to ignore the identification suggested by iNaturalist and use your own knowledge instead. So you've taken this presentation and you know that this critter has 6 legs, and you're going to put insect in here because you can see the head, you can see it's got 6 legs, it's got this nice little abdomen. You're confident it's an insect. You put insect in there. That allows the identifier community, those who are passionate and knowledgeable about insects, to find it more easily. So someone else can come along who knows about insects and say, aha, that is a dragonfly nymph. So that is what we mean by refining identifications. Of course, you might know that it is a dragonfly nymph and you can just put that in there, and someone else can come along and confirm your identification. The final tip for aquatic macroinvertebrate identification is to practice, practice, practice. My preferred method of practicing is you go out into the field. Just go out, keep scooping up those macros, take good pictures, and just parenthetically, I want to point you to the Photograph Macroinvertebrates module to help with the photography. But if you're like me, you live in a place where the water is frozen multiple months out of the year. And so that is really not an option to go in the field. So we use online resources to keep up our identification chops. The first, of course, being macroinvertebrates.org. Again, a huge shout out to them. They have a quiz that you can practice your identifying skills on. Any time you spend on that website is time well spent for identification um, skill enhancement. Once you get some confidence in your ability to identify, I suggest you go to our iNaturalist Macroblitz projects. And the reason I would like you to do that is one, that just become more familiar with iNaturalist, and two, the chances are pretty good that the photos you take will look more like the ones you see on iNaturalist than the ones you see on macroinvertebrates.org. The photos on macroinvertebrates.org are lovely. They're clear, they're well lit, there's exceptional detail. iNaturalist photos, they're identifiable. And so you want to be able to identify organisms in more of a real world situation. So that concludes our tips and tricks for identifying macroinvertebrates. Just to manage some expectations, you aren't going to become expert in macroinvertebrate identification after watching a 20-minute webinar. It does take some practice. I mean, there are people who literally have PhDs in this stuff. So, but I promise you, if you get out, if you practice, you will improve. If you have questions or if you want to share your strategies, your tips and tricks, please do so in our Google Classroom. And you can go to macroblitz.org for information on how to join the Google Classroom. Thank you so much for watching. And on behalf of our Macroblitz team, happy macroblitzing.